And now part 2 of the history of Love. One of the hottest bands in 1966, Love started to lose ground in 1967 among a sea of new bands with new sounds. They were second only to the Beach Boys in their notoriety for skipping out on Monterey. And Love marched to the beat of another drum, and that was Arthur Lee's drum. Rehearsals for the unnamed third album took place at Arthur's house, but this time around, his songs were a little more complex, and he had a harder time conveying what those songs sounded like to the band members. And because they were more complex, they didn't really have the time to go through them thoroughly, and these songs were really just presented as unfinished sketches. So as I mentioned in part 1, the band didn't tour a lot, and at this point, the band wasn't touring much at all. So this meant that there was less money coming in for the band as a total entity. And Arthur dismissed 2 of the members. He dismissed Jay Cantrelli, the flute player, and Snoopy Pfister, the keyboard player. He said, we won't need these guys for this next album, which is a shame because I thought their contributions were excellent. And Arthur had total control of the band, and the rest of the band, I guess, was okay with this so long as they weren't the ones being dismissed. But I think this brought up some other issues. In going into the third album, Brian McLean and John Eccles had an idea that they wanted to put forth toward Arthur. And that was that they would do a double album, and Brian and Johnny would each get one side, and Arthur would get 2 sides. So that was going to be titled Gethsemane, and that title comes from the biblical story where Jesus gets betrayed, and that's how they felt going into this double album. Arthur agreed to the arrangement, and I don't know how much pull he had with Elektra, or if they talked with Elektra about this. But when they got into the studio, everything changed. Elektra didn't want any part of doing a double album. They said it would cost way too much money, and Brian had songs written. They were going to be either barely used or just put forward to the next album. The person most upset with this was Brian McLean, because he had songs written. Johnny was also a writer, but not quite on the level that Brian was. But Brian was really pissed off about this. In addition to Elektra reneging on the double album, there was a producer issue as well. Arthur Lee was slated to produce this album. And I think that, Arthur was not the easiest guy to get along with, so I think Elektra wanted to have one of their guys do it. Bruce Botnick had done some engineering for them. Paul Rothchild had produced the prior album. So Botnick was kind of the heir apparent, and they brought him in, and I'm not sure why he did this, but Botnick brought in Neil Young to produce. And Botnick and Neil Young were buddies. Neil Young had quit Buffalo Springfield not that long ago, and he had kind of bottomed out trying to go solo. That didn't work. He was at loose ends. He was out of money, and I think he was about to be evicted, so Botnick was going to throw him a bone here and have him come and produce the Love album. The only problem was that Neil Young had less production experience than Botnick. So when the band came in and sees Neil Young, they just laughed. They're like, Neil Young's going to produce this? I mean, he's one of us. He's like, we know Neil. He's a peer of ours. They had played with him on the same bill as Buffalo Springfield. They had smoked pot together. So they're not going to listen to Neil Young. So that was a non-starter. Meanwhile, the band starts to lay down some of the basic tracks. Arthur's in the booth, and the band is rather stoned. Not only do they have a bad attitude coming in, but they're kind of stoned. And the basic tracks are not going well. There's a lot of stopping and starting and stumbling. And after a while, they just kind of halted, and Arthur's in the booth talking to the guys at Elektra. And then they have a meeting and say, hey, look, guys, I think we're going to bring in some session musicians here because we got to get this done. So that didn't go over very well with the band. So after a little bit of cajoling, they talked them into it. So the next day they show up, and there are a couple session players there. Now, Carol Kay was on bass. Of course, Hal Blaine was the drummer. And they laid down a couple of tracks.
In the morning we arise and start the day the same. And when you've given all you had and everything still turns.
Now Kenny and Johnny do play on those 2 tracks. And one of the problems is that after they were trying with the studio musicians, this was not going well. Carol Kay had the embarrassment of having Ken Forsey try to show her how to play bass like he does so it could sound more like Love. And Elektra realized that, hey, this isn't working. And they halted the studio session guys. And they decided, like, look, we want you guys. We want your sound. That's why we signed you guys to the label. So why don't you take your time, go back and rehearse some and we'll start this over again. So they sent the session cats home. Neil Young, who only put in like 2 hours, he just paid him to go away. And they came back very well rehearsed and ready to record. Some of the stories about this album and how the album started goes like this. It's like the band members were on heroin, and when they were told that session musicians were going to take their place, they started crying. Now this is not quite accurate. These guys, heroin wasn't really the big issue yet at this point. It would come in a little bit later. But these guys were just not ready to play in the studio, and they were just smoking cannabis, and they were just not sharp. As far as the crying, that is probably a little bit overblown as well. You know, now that they've been given a second opportunity, Johnny Echols went to Brian McLean and said, hey, look, do you want to go out not trying? I mean, this is probably going to be our last album, so why don't we just do our best? Let's go out, you know, guns a-blazing. So they decided to do that, and they came, like I said, well prepared, and they came motivated. Now, the working title of this album was called The Third Coming of Love, and that got changed when Brian McLean heard something that Arthur had said, something about forever changes. And it was about a girlfriend that Arthur had that he told her that he would love her forever, and apparently that didn't actually happen. And the girl said, hey, you said you'd love me forever. He said, well, forever changes. And Brian picked up on that, and that became the title of the album. Perhaps to pacify Brian McLean, the song Alone Again Or was released as the first single off this album.
And I will be alone again tonight, my dear.
This is a great Brian original. Unfortunately, it only charted at number 123 on Billboard. It charted better in the UK at number 58. And this had a really great Spanish feel to it that started off as a bluegrass song, actually. And as they worked on it, it got the Spanish feel. Now, this song, though it didn't chart well on Billboard, it did see plenty of rotation on the FM stations.
I ain't got no papers on myself.
Those are two of the harder sounding songs on the album, but most of this album is more delicate and sounds a little bit more like a Brian Wilson production.
Summertime's here, and look at their flowers every so eerie. And if you think I'm happy,
You know, when you listen to this album, it feels conceptual, but there was really no concept that the band was aiming for. And when you hear it, it's really reflective of a lot of the Sunset Strip riots. It talks a little bit about that and the skepticism of the hippie scene. And overall, the lyrics are a little more ironic than they are philosophical.
what should you need, I'll tell you. The end. This is the only thing that I am sure of.
You Set the Scene was an excellent closer, and originally was 3 separate songs, and Ken Forsey, the bass player, was the one that strung them all together, though he didn't receive any credit. Now, writer Ian MacDonald had said that this album will appeal to modern listeners because of its Rococo finery. So we see this late Baroque period of this excessive ornamentation on this album, and I think MacDonald really got it right. And this album really sounds like no other album, and I think that it's intricate while being accessible at the same time. So Johnny Echols said that Sgt. Pepper was a big influence on this record, and David Angel was the arranger for this, and he did a really good job with just a string octet and some brass. So that makes the album sound, give it that special sound without being overly orchestrated. Now, the cover art was designed by Bob Pepper, and this is supposed to be the shape of a heart, and it's all the band members' heads. I think that's pretty clever. Now, one of the things that a lot of people don't realize, there was a lot of work that led up to this album, but when they did get down to recording it, they only took about a week and a half to record this whole album. So they worked very efficiently. And the critics were positive. In fact, the LA Times, Pete Johnson said parts of the album are beautiful, others disturbingly ugly. Reflections of the pop movement towards realism. All of it says something. Now, Gene Youngblood of the LA Free Press said, "It shimmers like a precious stone," and dubbed it one of the finest collections of the new music. So with all that great press, it only got to 154 in the States, which is a shame because it's a wonderful album. And it was released in November of 1967, so it's late in the year. It's up against not only Pepper, but now Magical Mystery Tour is out, The Doors' first album. You've got Surrealistic Pillow. After Bathing Baxter's is about to come out. There's lots of competition, and this album, for some reason, people were not interested in buying. Now, in the UK, it was a different story. That went to 24 in the UK. Now, one of the things that doesn't get mentioned much is that the first two Love albums were not released domestically in the UK, so those were import only. And they had built up a pretty good reputation in the UK, and by the time this album came out, everybody was waiting for it because they couldn't buy the first two albums. So that really pushed this album onto the charts. In the UK, this album was released a few months after, so it was early 1968. So that may have helped with sales a little bit and didn't have to compete with the Christmas rush. But in early 1968, the band was in kind of bad shape financially. Arthur Lee had his Porsche in his swimming pool, and the other guys were having a hard time paying rent. And they were getting, their cars were being repossessed because there was no money coming in. Strangely enough, there was agreement between the band and Elektra, January 68, that said that all correspondence, statements, and notifications and royalties to the band would be sent through Arthur Lee. So this would be a bone of contention in later years because a lot of these royalties were not being paid to the band members. So meanwhile, Brian cut a deal with Elektra to do some of his own songs, and this was going to be concurrent with Love. So he figured he could do the solo album and still work with Love, but Arthur was against that. He said, look, either you're with Love or you're not with Love. So Brian chose to be with the band, and he put off the solo recordings. In early 1968, the band pressed on and started working on what would be tracks for the fourth album, and they recorded two songs that was released as a single.
In the closet, I don't need anyone. Oh, no, no, no.
This single didn't chart, and Bruce Botnick had had enough of Arthur Lee by this point and refused to work with him. So here's what Johnny said. "We weren't touring or playing as much. We needed money. We had creditors at our door. Then Jimi Hendrix was stealing our thunder. It was all slipping away. Instead of fighting to keep it, we just lulled ourselves to sleep with the drugs." So this is when they started to get into the heroin, and Arthur started shooting cocaine. By May of 1968, Elektra put together a proper tour that was outside of California. Now, I don't know what took them so long to do this, or they had to cajole the band to do it, or cajole Arthur. But some of these locations included Cleveland, Boston, Detroit, Chicago. And they did some warm-up shows in California first, and these shows went over very well. The only problem was that they were scheduled to do something in Florida at the Miami Pop Festival in May. And this was going to be the end of the tour. And there was a layover there of a few days. So Arthur flew back to Los Angeles, left the band in Miami. Now, unfortunately, as I mentioned, heroin had become a problem with some of these band members, and they were running out of their stash. So that was not going well. Meanwhile, Arthur was supposedly running back to Los Angeles, not to take care of business, as he said, but he had a girlfriend there that he was insecure about, and he didn't want her messing around. So he goes back there, and then there's some excuse made because one of the closing acts one day was going to be the Jimi Hendrix Experience, and the other was going to be Love, or so Arthur Lee thought. Word got back to him that the Mothers were going to close, so that got Arthur Lee's nose all out of joint, and he said, we're not going to do it. So the band that was waiting out there for days had to fly home without doing the show. So the band was really struggling. All these things were happening at the same time. You had Arthur Lee's girlfriend trying to get him away from the band so he could go solo. He doesn't need the band. So that was going on. Brian's upset. One of the road guys, Neil Rappaport, died of a drug overdose. That was heroin. Rock trends were changing, and they were trying to keep up with the Jimi Hendrix types and the louder sound. Meanwhile, a lot of their fans are expecting forever changes on stage, which is hard to produce. So through all this, Brian was still struggling, and Arthur wanted him out of the band. One of the things that happened from Forever Changes is that Arthur was very jealous that the single was Brian's song. So that basically ended their friendship, and he just preferred him out of the band and just wanted to have more control. Here's what Michael Stewart said. Having one of those songs picked as the single from Forever Changes is what did it for Arthur. That tore it apart. He figured he couldn't go on being in the band with Brian if they're going to pick Brian's songs over his. Despite all this, Love stumbled on, and they were still playing some live shows in California. And eventually Arthur called a meeting with the band members, minus Brian, basically saying he wanted to fire him. And the other band members refused that. They didn't want to fire Brian. So this was getting to be near the end here. So finally, Brian started recording some demos for a potential solo album.
Come along with me, want you to hear what the barber says. He may be speaking of something nice. Listen to Barber John. Ooh, your pretty little eyes are full of tears.
So it's plain to hear the quality of these Brian McLean songs, and it's a shame that these weren't allowed to be recorded. And they could have done another album very easily with quite a few of his songs. Now the band was still playing live a little bit. They even did a gig in Salt Lake City, which it didn't go over well. And at this point, the reviews were starting to be negative of their live shows because they were just kind of phoning it in, and they kind of hated each other, I guess. So by August, the band had heard that Arthur started putting together another band that he was going to call Love. So because the band didn't agree to fire Brian, Arthur ended up just firing everybody, essentially. So there was a band that he knew, Noonie Rickett 4. So Noonie Rickett was a singer-guitarist, and he appropriated a couple guys from that band, namely Frank Fayette on bass and George Saranovich on drums. Guitarist Jay Donellan had been playing with two former Love members, and that was Jay Cantrelli and Snoopy Pfisterer. And through them, they were able to arrange an audition for him to audition for Arthur Lee, and he ended up getting the job. Now, Jay had been with the psychedelic group Moore Park Intersection.
I think I'll just take a walk in the sunshine, follow his lazy path in the sky.
Here's what Arthur said about the new members. He said, I saw right away that I could get these guys. My mind would definitely be opened up to new and different styles of writing. In other words, to keep up with them and their group, I would have to change what I was doing to a heavier, jazzier, rock funk type of thing. And since the wind was blowing into more Cream Hendrix direction anyway, this totally made sense. And I think live audience expected louder and longer soloing. So this band was revealed at the Whiskey in summer of '68 and the end of August. And by September, Arthur had dispensed with the former management, and he became the full-fledged manager of the band Love. Now, fans were surprised to hear this harder rock approach, and the ones that were disappointed for not hearing a lot more of Forever Changes maybe lost a few fans but picked up some new fans as they started to do a harder rock and longer soloing. And they were still mainly doing just California dates. Love owed one more album to Elektra. And Arthur Lee knew this, but he was starting to shop around and see if he could get another deal to see what the next signing would be, what label he could hook up with. But unfortunately, his reputation was pretty bad, and a lot of labels didn't want to take a chance on him. And plus, their popularity was waning. So they did find one suitor, and that was Blue Thumb Records, which was a new label. So what they did was they got that deal signed, and they recorded a ton of songs, like about 25 songs, to satisfy the Elektra contract, and then put songs toward the new Blue Thumb album. So here's the next album for sale, the last Elektra album. And what happened was Elektra was given the choice to choose the songs. They recorded like 25 or more songs. So out of all those songs, Elektra got to compile this album. And it's a pretty good album. Now, it charted at number 102. So that's quite a bit better than Forever Changes. But the critics didn't like this as much. It lacked the old sound, so they said. It was just a different band. So people had to get used to it.
I'll be with you, my love, if you say you want me to. Anything you want, I'm trying to get it from you. I know, always see your face, and through the times I saw the true meanings of you, meanings like.
Now these songs are pretty close to the Forever Changes sound, but generally this album has a little heavier guitar sound.
Robert's Montgomery. I just got up from a dream. I dreamed that singing cowboy, got a lasso in your hand. Will you ever understand it's a do or die boy? This life is a...
These songs had a pretty good blend of the soft and the hard side of the band, and the band could play up that hard side when they were playing live and do these longer solos and things and give the audience what they wanted.
It's gonna be alright. It's gonna be alright. Hear it again for a long lost friend who passed away. Maybe it's better that way.
That last number was called Neil's Song, and that was an ode to their road manager who had OD'd. And not a very sensitive song either. But one of the other things that was interesting is that some of their older music was used in a film, the movie Medium Cool, and the song Emotions was used as a recurring theme. This album, did moderately well, and the leftover tracks basically that were recorded during these sessions was used for the next album called Out Here. And that album is this. Let's open it up here. This is a double album. Now, why Blue Thumb would want to do a double album, I have no idea. And one thing that they were a little bit nervous about, because this album, For Sale, didn't do that well, and the band was on a downward slide, Blue Thumb was trying to convince Arthur to get the original Love back together, even though they just changed the lineup. Now, everybody agreed to perform. Brian was not invited, and it just didn't sound the same without Brian, so that really went nowhere. And one of the problems was that there was no equal split in the money anymore. So with the playing live, Arthur was going to take the lion's share of the money, so the band just said, forget this. So Out Here, this is a painting that Arthur Lee had bought, and there's no name of the band on the album cover. This is the actual cover. That's not going to help you sell copies. I don't know why Blue Thumb, being a new label, wanted to do a double album. I think they could have taken the best songs from here and had a very solid single album, but they went forward with the double album. The album Out Here was released in December 1969, only 4 months after For Sale. So I don't know what they were thinking. I just think that they could have released a single album and spread it out a little bit more so they don't compete with one another. But as it turns out, there's a lot of good quality songs on this album. And some of them sound a little bit like Crosby, Stills and Nash, or what that first album was going to sound like. And this was recorded in late 1968, so it predates that album.
Replaced with city buildings. You told me once, all I did was complain, but that was long ago.
Now there are quite a few songs on here that are reminiscent of the Forever Changes period, so they didn't completely abandon that, and you'll find a lot of those type of songs on Out Here.
Can you hear me? If you can, I want you to listen to my song. I want to be alive. It's nice to be all over this big wide world. Can you see what needs to be done? Do you feel what's been...
These songs sound very much like Arthur Lee, and you can't take Arthur Lee out of the songwriting, but some of the songs that are more rock-oriented are very strong as well.
I'm down, down, down on the ground. Stand out. I think you ought to stand out. Everything's grand. I just got out of the army today.
Now we see an anti-war song with Discharge, which is a little bit one of the weaker songs on here, and they do a very interesting remake of Signed DC. This was a song that was originally on their first album, about Don Conca's drug problems. And interestingly enough, this is when Arthur Lee is starting to experience some drug problems of his own. And the slowed down, strung out version here sounds a little bit reminiscent of what John Lennon would later do on the Plastic Ono Band album.
Sometimes I feel so lonely.
You're going to find a couple 11, 12-minute songs on this album. They just get strung out to ridiculous lengths just to pad out the album, I suppose. Or for live workouts, I suppose that worked live, but it doesn't really work on the album very well. And again, if you cut out the fat, this would have made a very fine single album. But Blue Thumb did what they did, and this album got to number 176. So it's getting back to the bottom of the doldrums here, although it hit number 29 in the UK. And part of that reason is because they toured Europe on this album, and they went to Denmark and Sweden and the UK. So that spurred sales on that side of the Atlantic. Now, Draken Thacker, formerly of the Crazy World of Arthur Brown, stepped into the Crazy World of Arthur Lee and drummed on 4 songs over this album and For Sale, while George Saranovich had an argument with Lee regarding money. Since Arthur had the power to fire and hire at will, you would have thought he would have fired George Saranovich over this, but he did not. The guy who got fired was guitar player Jay Donelon, and it was over a dispute at a live gig. There was this great outdoor festival that they were going to play at in Oakland, and they were slated to be the second last band. Blood, Sweat, and Tears was closing. But since Arthur, who's now managing the band, he neglected to get a van hired to handle all the gear and transport it to the show. This caused a delay, so Love got there over an hour late. So the promoter said, well, you're going to lose your spot because Blood, Sweat, and Tears is contracted to close the show. So Arthur got really lippy with the promoter and, had a few choice words for him. And what happened was George and Jay went over to Blood, Sweat, and Tears and explained the situation, and they were cool. They said, yeah, no problem, we'll go first. You guys can close the show, not a problem. But by this time, Arthur was so worked up that he wouldn't even do it. He said, no, we're all going home. Forget it, we're not doing the show. So Donelon really gave it to Lee, and he was fired over it. So needing a new guitarist, he picked another player from the Nooney Rickett band, Gary Rowells. He was the son of jazz pianist Jimmy Rowells. So the band did some warm-up gigs in the States and then headed over to Europe and were received very warmly and had some very good shows there. Now, audiences always wanted to hear Forever Changes, so the band was still playing those songs. Here's an example of some of the songs they played on this tour. They played My Little Red Book, Orange Skies, and Morrigan, Sign DC, and Bummer in the Summer. So while they were in the UK, Arthur got together with Jimi Hendrix because they were old buddies and they always respected one another quite a bit. And Hendrix recorded a song with them. Naturally, Blue Thumb was ecstatic to have Hendrix guesting on this album, and they even released it as a single in Europe, but it didn't chart. Now, these songs sound like they've got some great pop hooks in them, and this is really different than what they played live. Some of these songs on the album would go into a long jam at the end of it, so when they played these live, the focus was more on the jam than really the melody.
Ride that vibration down like a bucking brown. Don't let it get you down. Run to the top of the highest mountain. Look all over this big wide world. You are something to me, but just what it is I don't know. But
these songs are really not that different from the style that Arthur was typically writing in over the last couple of albums, and some of the songs are very good.
I had a dream last night. You say you love me, but you know love is more than words.
Unfortunately, many of these songs are adorned with the obligatory long solos and this real boogie rock sound that wasn't really them, but it was good live, but it didn't really translate to the studio very well.
I like to perform on stage better than I do in the studio. I'd rather perform in front of people dancing or a large arena or whatever. I like to get my point across that way, but I have more time, and I'm not on a rush basis of trying to please or trying to create excitement or whatever. You know what I mean? In the studio, I'm able to just say what I want to say, get out, you listen to it, you hear it, take it, or leave it.
So the appearance of Hendrix on this album, this is false start here. The fact that Hendrix was on this album, critics really took note of that, and it was generally received fairly well by the critics. Now this album only got to number 184, and it didn't even chart in the UK. So all the talk we hear about the UK loving this band, they couldn't even chart this. So one of the things I failed to mention is when they moved over to Blue Thumb, they were able to take, not obviously the name, but the logo as well. So you see this logo continue through the releases. Rolling Stone magazine gave False Start a very good review, and Blue Thumb was so convinced it would be a hit that they said, if it's not a hit, Arthur, we'll let you out of your contract. And it wasn't a hit, so Blue Thumb stood by their agreement and let Arthur Lee out of his contract. So Arthur at this time was still hanging around Hendrix quite a bit, and there was some talk of him forming a band with Hendrix and Steve Winwood called Band Aid. That never materialized. And this album is actually, got a pretty good sound, and Nooney Rickett himself plays on this as a second guitar player, so it's got a pretty full sound. With Arthur free from his contract with Blue Thumb, he was free to do a solo career now and dispense with the band altogether. The 1972 solo album Vindicator did not chart, and then he formed an all-black band in 1973 for an album that was never released called Black Beauty.
That's when I know I should be returning, but I just don't know. Thomasine and Bushrod were more than just two names, but why and what they wanted is not.
Now this band was a little bit more rock funk, and I think Arthur wanted to experiment with an all-black band, but it didn't get released till a couple decades later. Now that same band went to the studio and recorded another Love album, which was released in 1974 called Reel to Reel on RSO.
Stand tall, everybody singing, diamonds in the back, sunroof top, digging the scene with a gangster lean. Ooh, yeah.
So the Black Beauty band consisted of Joe Blocker, Melvin Whittington, and Robert Rosell. Paul Rothschild produced that. When they did Reel to Reel, they added a couple more musicians. They added Buzzy Featon, Harvey Mandel on guitars, and then Bobby Lyle on piano. They opened for acts like Eric Clapton and Lou Reed on that tour, so they had some pretty good visibility on the live circuit, but that album just didn't click anywhere. So by the late 70s, there were some half-hearted attempts to reunite the band Love, and Lee struggled in general just to reach a wider audience. He would just do small shows, and he still gigged and everything, but he was without a record contract for long stretches at a time. He ended up getting busted for a gun charge in the 90s because there was this three strikes you're out rule in California. You fired a gun in the air and did about 5 years. This also ruined a scheduled Love reunion that they were going to work on together. So the original band never reformed again, unfortunately. But when he did get out, they did go on a tour. It was the 35th anniversary of Forever Changes, and he toured with Johnny Eccles and a new Love band. And I was able to see that back in about 2005, and they toured with the Zombies, and that was a really good show. Love is one of those handfuls of bands that, although they didn't achieve great fame or success in their heyday, all these decades later they are praised and their work is getting recognized for the art that it is. So that is my history on Love. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like what I do and want to support this channel in a bigger way, feel free to look at my Patreon subscription. I'll leave a link below on that. I also have some merchandise you can purchase that will also help support this channel. And I'll have plenty other bands coming for you to check out here on Pop Goes the 60s. Thanks for watching.